It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP Laura Farris, SNP MP Alan Smith, LBC radio presenter Ian Dale and Guardian and Observer columnist Sonia Soda. Today...
Object.
That shout of object means claims of sleaze rumble on. Former cricketer Azim Rafiq tells MPs about racism in the sport.
I started to see for what it was, felt isolated, humiliated at times.
How worried should we be about COVID?
I want to update you on our progress and in particular on the storm clouds that are gathering over parts of the continent.
Will Nicola Sturgeon extend vaccine passports in Scotland later today? We're going to start with something you saw very briefly there in the headlines from the Commons Chamber last night. Let's show you a slightly longer extract of what happened there.
We now come to a motion relating to the Committee on Standards, and I call the Minister to move formally.
Object.
Objection taken.
Wow.
So, government attempts there to reverse changes proposed last week to the standards system and accept the report into the Standards Committee. Findings on Owen Paterson's paid advocacy were blocked by a Tory MP. You heard object there from Christopher Chope. That means that any government hope to move on from allegations of sleaze diminished because there's now going to be a debate and vote today, whereas there wasn't going to be a debate. It could have gone through on the nod. So, Laura, what's your message to your Conservative colleague, Christopher Chope?
Well, I have to say, I don't know why he called object. I don't know Christopher Chope, actually. But there is going to be a debate today. We got the updated order paper this morning, and it will still be voted on later on. Right.
Are you disappointed?
I'm surprised. I mean, I think, the government accepts that it went wrong with the vote on Owen Paterson, and it wasn't a sort of, it was an unequivocal reintroduction of the same vote, and we expected it to go through last night, and I don't think anyone was expecting that.
Right. Do you understand the anger that has clearly been expressed by Conservative MPs and those in government?
Of course I do, and I think you can see it on the Deputy Speaker's face, if I'm honest. I mean, I have to say, I think it was a surprise. I don't understand exactly what it was seeking to achieve, but nonetheless, it will be back before the House this afternoon.
I mean, Alan, no one will claim that you and Christopher Chope are political bedfellows, but you must be rather pleased.
Some would, actually.
You must be rather pleased he did, because there will now be a debate and a discussion about this.
I don't think he was trying to help the opposition, but Special Agent Chope really did us all a solid with that one. We do get to ventilate this again, but the government got it wrong. It's admitted it got it wrong. It was an egregious attempt a couple of weeks back to shut the committee down. I think that was appalling. But there was an apology, and the government learned its lesson and was trying to get this through, and then Mr Chope, for whatever reason, has been singularly unhelpful to the government, but that does give the Chamber an opportunity to properly discuss this. So, good. I suspect the result's going to be the same, but the fact that we now get to ventilate this is probably a useful thing all round.
I mean, Alan, Ian says here that actually Christopher Chope, we don't know why he did it, but he has defended himself. He's spoken to his local newspaper because he's got form on this, hasn't he, Ian?
Yes, he does, and the reason he did it was he doesn't believe things should just go through on the nod without any debate. Now, his Conservative colleagues, you're absolutely right, are incandescent about this. Just when they thought they were getting rid of it in the headlines, he's now put it back in the headlines. So they need this like they need a hole in the head. But he's done it before. There was on upskirting and on female genital mutilation. He did exactly the same thing and had exactly the same reaction. So he must have the skin of a rhinoceros to do this yet again.
Right. Well, as you say, infuriated many people, even if Laura was being relatively diplomatic about it. Let's have a look at this headline in The Times, because Labour is to force vote-seeking ban on second jobs for MPs. This is an Opposition Day debate tomorrow, calling for some second jobs to be banned, including paid consultancies. Sonia, Labour want to keep this going, don't they, this row?
They absolutely do. And I think there's a good reason why, which is that this whole affair, it's so unedifying, has really raised very important questions about the kinds of work that MPs do outside their main parliamentary duties and get paid for. And I personally think, I think there is maybe, if not a ban on second jobs, there's a very good case for a strong and quite modest cap on earnings from outside your parliamentary work. But I think also what really needs to be distinguished between is work that is a conflict of interest, so the sorts of work that MPs take, advising corporates, and they're essentially getting paid because of their knowledge as an MP, and sometimes asking questions, as we've seen through revelations in the last couple of weeks, asking questions really that are in the interest of the people who are paying them in Parliament.
Right, well, just to clarify what Labour will be calling for, it is a ban on MPs having paid directorships and commercial consultancies. Now, Labour have told us that they think the vote will be binding. It does depend on how precisely the motion is worded, and that is going to be published later on. But broadly, in principle, what are you going to do in that vote tomorrow, Laura?
OK, can I just pick up, Jo, on what Sonia was saying, because I do partly agree with her. I concede completely that the last couple of weeks have cast a spotlight on what MPs do and the amount of time that they're devoting to their duties, and I think probably all three of us will agree on that. I am slightly nervous about any vote that singles out directors or consultants, because that's perhaps business people more likely to be Conservative MPs, and they could be advising on, for example, technological trends or environmental waste strategy, and that might be their previous career. We can't really say at the same time that some, for example, lawyers in the Labour Party, including the leader of the Labour Party, are allowed to give legal advice to companies, but somebody acting as a consultant can't give technology advice, and then we have a vote that's basically targeting all the Tory MPs, but all the Labour MPs can do their thing. So I think actually we need to be really careful and sensible about what we're really saying. And actually, Sonia, I think the way you introduced it and the kind of issues that have been engaged is exactly right, and I'm not sure we've quite got there with the contours of where this should end up.
I would agree, actually, that I think you need to be careful how you draw the line in order to exclude everything where there's a potential conflict of interest, and putting those definitions on it is quite difficult but important. But I also think it's not just about conflict of interest, and actually I think, that I really think MPs shouldn't be taking money from private companies, full stop, if they're in Parliament, because I do think the potential for conflict of interest is there. But it's also about the number of hours you're working. So if you're looking at an MP who's taking in huge amounts of money as a lawyer, like Sir Geoffrey Cox, the worry I have about that is if your earnings outside of Parliament are a multiple of your earnings as an MP, what are you going to prioritise? And actually, I think when you look at Sir Geoffrey Cox and the fact, that he was doing all this work abroad while Parliament was sitting during the pandemic, making use of rules like proxy voting that were there because of the pandemic, that's really troubling as well.
What would you say about the issue of Geoffrey Cox?
Well, I don't want to get drawn on him, but I do think actually you make a really good point about the amount of time that MPs spend doing their jobs. And look, being an MP is a full-time job.
Absolutely.
It is. The only thing I possibly would say is that there are some MPs at the very top who could, for example, former prime ministers who might have outside interests, for example, speaking engagements and so on, and nonetheless their contributions in the chamber are probably going to be superior to anyone's, and they can often be, a very superior form of backbencher because they've seen government in such an up-close way that their inputs are unique. But I think overall, anything that detracts from the idea that being an MP is a full-time job is damaging, actually, to the impression of Parliament.
Which way will you vote, Alan? Will you vote to ban MPs from having paid directorships and commercial consultancies or not?
Well, as you've rightly said, we've not seen the motion yet. And I agree with a lot of what Laura's saying, actually. We're both lawyers to trade. We need to see the text of what we're actually voting upon. I have no difficulty whatsoever in saying there should be no paid outside interests, but outside interests are much wider than that. And are we covering things like speaking engagement? Are we covering things like, I've been a director of various charities, always unpaid. I've never had a paid outside interest, but I have had outside interests, I still do.
Or writing a book, again, you could write a book about politics. It could be a useful, important work that you get paid for.
There's a real need to regulate this stuff, and Westminster has a problem with this stuff. Westminster has a problem with this stuff on a regular basis. And let's talk about consultancies in the House of Lords while we're at it. There's a cesspit that needs to be drained here. I think the Labour motion odds on we're going to be in favour of it, but let's see what it actually says. But I think there's a wider question that needs to be answered about, exactly as Laura says, what's an MP actually there to do? I think we can all agree an MP is a full-time job.
Right.
But there's a wider picture to be looked at.
Well, if it is a full-time job, what do you make then of your boss Ian Blackford, who has earned significant sums of money while also being an MP and the leader of the SNP in Westminster? Is that justifiable? I mean, the Scotsman has been going through Ian Blackford's register of interests over the last few years, and he's been quite busy because they say he's been working as chairman of an investment fund until earlier this year. He was earning over £3,000 a month, as well as £1,500 a day for any additional work. He was also chairman of a telecommunications company until December 2019, and he was earning £1,000 per month for that role. Is that justifiable if you say it is a full-time job, being an MP?
Well, this is the thing about whataboutery is really dangerous in this. And Ian is a successful business person. He was elected in 2019. He committed to get rid of those directorships, which he has. Now, that's not something you necessarily do overnight, but I think there's a wider question. This is my point. There's a wider question here that needs to be discussed so that future MPs know what they're coming into and present MPs know what's acceptable and what isn't. Because the style at the moment is, so long as it's declared it's all right and somehow my constituents will make that ruling, when actually that's not really effective.
Ian?
Well, when I stood for Parliament in 2005, one of my election pledges was not to have any outside interests, which 15 years ago was quite something for a candidate to do. In fact, a lot of good it did me, but anyway. And a lot of other candidates said, why have you done this? Because we'll be expected to do it now. Well, then the expenses scandal came, and in 2010, what did we see? A lot of Conservative candidates did exactly that. Now, I think it is really difficult to know where to draw the line because, I mean, I ran a small bookshop and publishing business. Was that really going to affect my ability to do my job? Well, I just took the decision that being an MP, particularly in a massive rural constituency, is a full-time job. Now, everyone has to make their own decisions, and I think there probably is a case for some sort of regulation. But you take David Lammy, for example, who hosts a weekly radio show on LBC, my radio station. Is that a second job? I mean, he's on there for 3 hours, probably spends another 2 or 3 hours in preparation for the programme. He's in the shadow cabinet. Is that going to be covered under this? I'm not sure. I think it ought to be. I think you can't have a blanket ban. There's got to be some sort of... I mean, Richard Bergen's bill, which he's presenting to outlaw this, he's suggesting that the Committee on Standards in Public Life, or the Standards Committee in the House of Commons, should have a presumption that nobody should have any outside interest, but there will be exceptions, and they would be the arbiters of that. I mean, that's one idea. I'm not sure whether that's the right forum or not, but I think the time is coming when it is going to happen. And the question is, how many MPs will then think, OK, well, if you're going to do that, I'm not going to be an MP anymore. As some people would say, well, good riddance. If you're not doing it full time, we don't need you.
Right.
I think one of the things that this discussion is highlighting is that there do need to be much better rules. But the problem is, and I think it relates actually to the expenses scandal, which Ian just brought up, which is that it doesn't matter how good your rules are. If there are some people who think that they can game the system and do everything that is within the letter of the rules but not the spirit of the rules, there are going to be problems. And one of the things that I find so disappointing about the revelations of the last 2 weeks is it's very clear that there are some MPs, not a majority of MPs, but some MPs who did not take that lesson from the expenses scandal, that you've got to be better than getting away with absolutely everything that the rules allow you to get away with.
One other quick point is that I think we mustn't run away with the fact that there are hundreds of MPs who are bad apples. We all know that there are bad apples in every walk of life, in teaching, in journalism, in nursing, or doctors. There will always be a very small minority of people who break the rules in one regard. And there are among MPs. But,
yes.
I mean, let's not think that it's 200 or 300 out of 650 MPs that are on the take.
Right. I mean, just before we move on, I mean, Alan, would you like Ian Blackford, as leader of the SNP in Westminster, to give that job his undivided attention? I know he gave up that role, or one of them certainly, in March, but he had been leader of the SNP at Westminster for a number of years. Was that, but I mean, just broadly speaking, was that not right?
I think back to my point about whataboutery is dangerous in this whole discussion. Ian is the popular leader of the SNP Westminster group. He's doing a blinding job holding the government to account.
But would constituents understand that?
Well, he was re-elected twice. So He had outside interest because he's a successful business person. He's divested
But
himself
Geoffrey Cox was also elected, wasn't he, again?
Yeah, these interests, there's a world of difference between having outside interests when you're elected to earning 9 times your salary from a breach in the British Virgin Isles lobbying against your own government. Right. Whataboutery is really dangerous in this stuff. We do need to get it fixed, but it needs to be done right.
Right, and whataboutery meaning exactly what? That we can't look at other parties or...
Everybody should be scrutinised properly, absolutely, but the idea that there is an issue here that Westminster as a whole has a problem with is something that we need to address, and we'll look at the Labour motion when it comes forward later today, and I suspect we'll be voting for it. But there's a wider question that needs to be answered here about what MPs are actually here to do. It is a full-time job, and what outside interest we should have is something that needs to be properly regulated because the present system's clearly failing.
All right, we're going to move on and talk about this story broken by Sky News. If I just show you the tweet, I'll read it to you, Ian. Conservative MP Caroline Noakes has alleged that Stanley Johnson, Prime Minister Boris Johnson's father, touched her inappropriately in 2003. Stanley Johnson says he has no recollection of her. Let's talk to our chief political correspondent, Adam Fleming. Tell us about the claims.
Afternoon, Joe. Well, the first claim was made by Caroline Noakes, Conservative MP who chairs the Women's and Equalities Committee in the House of Commons. She was speaking to Sky News on a special programme they did last night about sexual harassment at Westminster. She didn't name Stanley Johnson directly, but she detailed some circumstances that pointed very clearly towards him, and she said that this person, who she described as a high-profile Conservative male, had touched her inappropriately at a Conservative Party conference in Blackpool back in 2003. Then overnight, the New Statesman political correspondent Alva Ray tweeted on social media that she had been, in her words, groped by Stanley Johnson at a party at the Conservative Party conference in 2019. Now, Sky News caught up with Stanley Johnson at his home on camera, and he said to them that he had no recollection of Caroline Noakes. In terms of the second claim, I've been texting, emailing and phoning him all morning, and there is no response from the Prime Minister's father as yet.
All right, Adam Fleming, thank you very much. Caroline Noakes said something else in the interview that she did, where she said, Laura, I would have been in my early 30s, so old enough to call it out. I now regard it as a duty, an absolute duty, to call out wherever you see it. Be the noisy, aggravating, aggressive woman in the room, because if I'm not prepared to do that, then my daughter won't be prepared to do that. You do get to a point where you go, up with this, I will not put. Do you agree with her on that point, that you must call it out? It is every woman's duty to do so if they come across that sort of behaviour.
Well, I'm not commenting on this particular allegation. I don't know anything about it.
That's why I'm asking you about her.
But on the principle,
yes.
Do I think that women should call out harassment? I do, yes. And I do think in the last few years that the sort of contours of that conversation have developed in Westminster and beyond.
Right, so do you think she should be congratulated for bringing this to light, Caroline Noakes?
Well, look, I say I support the principle that a woman should call out sexual harassment, but...
Sonia?
I do, but I think we have to acknowledge as well that it can be very difficult for women to do it in the workplace. I think hopefully cultures have changed a bit since we saw sort of the Me Too kind of, hashtag take effect kind of 3 years ago. But I think probably lots of women, I've experienced stuff in the workplace which is not acceptable, but didn't feel able to raise it at the time because I knew that if I did, actually, the only person who was going to suffer, whose career was going to suffer, was me. And I think lots and lots of women have been in that position. So I also think that, I think women who do call this stuff out are incredibly brave and courageous, and they sort of help make it easier for other women to do so. But I think we also need to ask some quite serious questions because we're 3 years on from Me Too now. And it's very powerful to hear some of these revelations, but it doesn't always lead to the institutional change. And I think if you look at Parliament itself, I think the parliamentary authorities and I think political parties have actually been really slow to respond well enough to women who said that they've had issues and to make sure that there's cultural shifts so it doesn't happen to young women working in Parliament and young men going forward. So I feel like cultural change has been very, very slow.
I think in Parliament, Sonia, I kind of agree with you. What was primarily the focus of Parliament was female staffers. And I think when the Westminster story became, very prominent through Newsnight, it was about people who worked in Parliament for MPs and about the sort of secret cultures in each MP's office. And I think that that's something that You know, I think that sort of imbalance of power was something that was reported and was well covered. That if you work for an MP, you know, if you report them, the employee was more likely to end up taking the consequences than the Member of Parliament themselves. And I think that has been, that sort of asymmetry of power was something that was thrown into the spotlight in the last couple of years.
All right, we're going to talk about COVID because the Prime Minister gave a press conference yesterday and had this warning. Let's have a listen.
I want to update you on our progress, and in particular on the storm clouds that are gathering over parts of the continent. A new wave of COVID has steadily swept through Central Europe and is now affecting our nearest neighbours in Western Europe. We don't yet know the extent to which this new wave will wash up on our shores, but history shows that we cannot afford to be complacent.
Just before I get your response, Ian, just to give some examples of what is happening in parts of Europe. In the Netherlands, there is a lockdown light, they've called it, for a number of weeks, trying to reduce social contacts. In Austria, those that haven't been fully vaccinated against COVID-19 have been placed in lockdown. And in Germany, the health minister has warned of a pandemic of the unvaccinated. Ian, are you worried, as the Prime Minister seems to be, that we may be heading the same way as the parts of Europe?
Well, nobody knows. It's entirely possible. The problem is that most of the predictions about when there's likely to be a new wave have actually been wrong. And if they've been right, the extent of that new wave has also been wrong. But I mean, of course, we've got to be concerned if there are increasing cases throughout Europe. Inevitably, that is going to affect us. We've got reasonably free travel now between this country and most European countries. I can see travel restrictions possibly being reintroduced. I can't conceive that we could possibly go back to anything like the kind of lockdowns that we have experienced over the next few months. But look, you can't make a judgment until you see what is facing you. And if all of the scientists agree that there is a danger of not just increased infections, but I mean, particularly there are still too many people that are unvaccinated. If it looks as if there are going to be a massive increase in hospitalizations and deaths, then I can see some restrictions being reintroduced, but I can't bring myself to believe that it would ever lead, that we'll have another full lockdown again.
Right. I mean, Laura, do you think there will be further restrictions? Do you think that's the way we're headed, having listened to what Ian's been saying?
Well, I agree with Ian. There's an inherent unpredictability in all of this. But of course, we know that it's harder to manage COVID in winter than summer. We know that there's more pressure on the NHS. I'm not going to sort of foresee, but this time last year we were on the brink of going into stage 4, stage 3, 4, then full lockdown. So I think everything needs to be focused on trying to avoid that, because I think a lockdown is almost unsustainable in the future.
Right, there has been some divergence between England and Scotland in terms of the response. Nicola Sturgeon is set to reveal today if further coronavirus restrictions will be brought in to help address a rising number of cases. One of the things that could be included, Alan, is the extension of the vaccine passport scheme to cover more indoor hospitality and leisure venues. If you have a look at this in the Eye, the headline says, "Don't push us over the edge, businesses tell Sturgeon." Do you have some sympathy with them, Alan?
I've got sympathy with everybody. Nobody's having a good time on this. I've got particularly hospitality businesses across Stirling that are really on their uppers, and they're having the triple whammy of COVID, Brexit and the effect of COVID economically.
So would you also say to Nicola Sturgeon, don't do this, don't extend it further?
Well, we'll need to balance all these interests against public health, because the economy is not going to do very well if lots of people are dying, and we need to take the public health risk seriously. And what we are seeing is, and this is where I take really grave issue with the Prime Minister's phrasing of there's things in Europe that might be coming to our shores. This is here now. This is a crisis now. The UK's got some of the worst numbers in the world on this stuff. We're seeing also a huge dichotomy between those who have been vaccinated and those who have not been vaccinated. And there's clear evidence from other countries that if we extend the vaccine passport stuff, then that encourages people to get their jags, as they absolutely should do. So there's a lot of things to be balanced here. Nicola Sturgeon will be announcing later today what's going to be a new package, if there is going to be a new package, and I don't know if there is or not, but we'll do what we've been doing throughout this, which is balancing all these really complex, really legitimate interests in the best way that we can.
Laura?
Well, I think the strategy in England is quite clear, which is that they're focusing on the booster vaccinations and maintaining the immunity levels over and above things like vaccine passports. The comment that you read out from the newspaper reveals the inherent tension between that type of, documenting process and what it means for businesses and hospitality and their chances. It's a sequence of very difficult decisions, competing pressures, inevitable trade-offs and, very difficult compromises with judgment calls that have to be made projecting into the future.
Right. I mean, should vaccine passports, Sonia and Ian, be introduced in England? I'll just give you some of the figures. According to the latest numbers from the Office for National Statistics, for the week ending the 6th of November, they estimated 1 in 60 people in England and 1 in 85 people in Scotland had COVID. Scotland is already doing this to some extent and may go further. Should England, Sonia?
I think it's a pragmatic question. So I have, in principle, no issue at all with asking people if they're going to be doing particular things to make sure that they've been vaccinated and to limit those things to people who've been vaccinated unless they can't for health reasons. So I've got no principal problem with it. Pragmatically, I think it's a question of how high are our rates and how much difference is our COVID passports projected to make. And so there was some leaked government analysis about COVID passports in relation to nightclubs and big events, which sort of seemed to suggest that they would reduce community transmission at those events by 40%, and that in the wider community by sort of anything, but I think it was between 1 and 5%. So that sounds very marginal, but actually when you've got rates very high, that can start to make a big difference. So for me, it is entirely a pragmatic issue, and it may be something that we absolutely need to do this winter.
Ian?
I would be reluctant to do it. I don't think we've seen the evidence so far certainly from Scotland, that it's made a material difference. It may have made a difference at the edges. But in the end, we're all going to have to learn to live with COVID. And that's why it is so important that people do get vaccinated. And it's quite clear now that if you are vaccinated, you are far less likely to be hospitalised or to die. The figures bear that out. And it's very frustrating when you hear people arguing that the vaccination makes no difference at all. So I would be reluctant to introduce vaccine passports across the board. I think there might be an argument for introducing them in 1 or 2 sectors. But as Alan said, look, the hospitality sector has gone through so many travails over the last year and a half. I think for them to have an extra burden now, I think it would kill so many businesses.
Well, on the question of vaccine passports, a Tesco TV Christmas advert has caused some controversy, with some saying it's coercive because the advert shows Father Christmas with one. The Advertising Standards Authority is reviewing the complaints. Let's have a look.
Breaking news. Santa could be quarantined.
Next.
Can you see why that's upsetting or not?
I think that's great.
Well, it made you all laugh.
Top marks, Tesco.
Top marks to Tesco. What about you, Laura?
What, should Santa be quarantined?
Well,
Not
should Santa be quarantined necessarily, but can you understand, if at all, why some people are complaining?
Yeah.
No, clearly. You can't.
Not really.
OK, we will move on to something much more serious. The former cricketer, Azim Rafiq, has been giving evidence to the Digital Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee this morning about his experience of racism at Yorkshire Cricket Club. Let's play you some of the proceedings.
Pretty early on, me and other people from Asian background, there was comments such as, "You lot sit over there near the toilets," elephant washers, the word was used constantly, and there just seems to be an acceptance in the institution from the leaders, and no one ever stamped it out. End of 2017, we had a really difficult pregnancy, and through that time, the treatment that I received from some of the club officials was inhuman. They weren't really bothered about the fact that I was at training one day and I get a phone call to say there's no heartbeat. Sorry.
So, would you be fair to say that what you've seen in Yorkshire, is it on the grapevine, in fact, is it replicated in other counties?
Without a shadow of a doubt. This is a problem up and down the country. I think I would like to see it as progress, that people are feeling like they can come forward and they're going to be heard, and not just be discredited, smeared about, briefed about. I think I would see that as a progress. To be clear, Rutie's a good man. He's never engaged in racist language. I found it hurtful because Rutie was not only Gary's housemate, Rutie was involved before he started playing for England. He was involved in a lot of them socialising nights out where I'd been called but again, it just shows, and he might not remember it, but it just shows how normal it was in that environment, in that institution, that even a good man like him doesn't see it for what it is.
So the references there to Root or Rutie is Joe Root, captain of the England team. Much of that testimony, and I listened to an awful lot of it this morning, was very difficult to hear and very upsetting. Sonia, what did you make of it?
I thought it was horrifying, and I think it's a reminder, actually. I mean, I think, first of all, I just think he's really brave to be talking about it in the way that he is. I think what's so kind of shocking about it is that we're talking about really disgusting, vile, outright racism, and we're not talking about something that was 20 years ago, 30 years ago. We're talking about stuff literally in the last few years. And I think Azim Rafiq really put his finger on it when he's talking about this isn't just about one or two individuals engaging in vile language, as problematic as that is. This is about institutional cultures whereby other people just stand by and are silent. And it was very, very difficult to listen to his testimony. And I think it raises real questions, actually, because there's been a lot of debate about anti-racism in this country. We have the Sewell report produced by the government, which in my mind really undermined the extent of racism in this country. No one's saying that things haven't got better in the last 40, 50 years. I think it's quite clear if you look at public attitudes, they have. But it is wrong to say that outright racism has almost been eliminated from the UK, for example. And it is wrong to say that institutional and structural discrimination and racism doesn't exist. And we've really got to take a good look at it as a country. And I really hope we're going to see some proper reforms now made in cricket, because it's very clear this wasn't just a handful of incidents. This is a problem that runs right through cricket in this country.
Ian, what did you make of it?
Well, I watched most of it as well, and it was horrifying. And Azim Rafiq is he seems an incredibly nice guy, a very believable guy. I don't think anybody could watch that and think that he was either exaggerating or inventing things. I mean, he's gone through hell over the last few years with this kind of thing. And you can't, I mean, some people put these things down to, locker room banter. Well, it was far more than that. When he was 15, he had red wine poured down his throat. Now, you don't have to be Einstein to know that Muslims don't drink alcohol. Now, he wasn't in a position to call people out at the age of 15 for that, but the teammates were, and not one of them stood up to defend him on any of this, apparently. And I think Sonia is right. This is not just Yorkshire County Cricket Club. This goes on, not just in cricket. This will have gone on in many, many different sports, in many, many different workplaces as well. And I hope what he's done gives other people the courage to call it out. You were talking earlier about women calling things out. Sometimes it is not easy to do it, particularly if you are in a junior position in an organisation. But I think the more people that do speak out, the more courage it gives others to do exactly the same thing.
Alan, I mean, people might think that football's problems with racism have been pretty well documented. Not that it's been erased, but it's been pretty well documented. Do you think there hasn't been enough scrutiny on other national sports like cricket?
Well, there's an element to sport that is a bit beery, a bit blokey, a bit bantery, and that leads into other stuff. But I was just really sad watching that testimony. I was at Leeds Uni for my first degree. We'd go up to Headingley with a crate of Tetley bitter, and really happy memories of it. And what he was describing was a culture of racism, not individual things. But that's something that really does need to be properly worked through. And I think the first step to solving a problem is acknowledging that we have one, and what he's saying needs to be taken really, really seriously.
Laura?
I thought it was a searing testimony. I thought it said an awful lot about the leadership and management structures at the club, and I think it is revealed actually by the fact that the other players identified it as banter. If you look at the Equality Act or even the Race Relations Act, its predecessor, the test of racial harassment has never been in the sort of what the perpetrator says it is. It's how the victim experiences. Yes, judged to an objective standard, you can't be hypersensitive, but that sort of idea that locker room talk was tolerated or permitted, I think says it all. And actually one of the things he said that I thought was particularly powerful is how hard it is to admit to yourself that you're a victim of racism. For a long time he was sort of almost avoiding it in his own mind, and he said that I think in answer to Damien Green quite early on.
I mean, it would be interesting to see what the response is to that testimony from senior figures in cricket, I mean, including the England captain Jo Root.
Absolutely. I think we do need to hear from them, really, particularly given that he himself was named in Azim Rafiq's testimony. But I think the lack of leadership from cricket and the amount that they've got wrong, even just in the last month since his revelation, this is why it's so it's so contemporary. This story, we're not talking about something historic, and it's got so much wrong even in the last month. And I hope that they can start to pull it back now that there's been a change of leadership at Yorkshire. But it's been really bad.
Yes, Ian.
Sorry, Jo. Can I just say a word about the way these proceedings were broadcast? Because I was watching on Sky News, and at the beginning of the proceedings, they were actually censoring what Azim Rafiq was saying, not by bleeping, but just by cutting the sound. I'm thinking, are you mad? That we need to hear this testimony, and it's going to be quite painful for many people, but you can't judge what's going on unless you're actually allowed to hear it. Now, as I understand it, quite a few staff of Sky News from ethnic minorities were watching this and were absolutely outraged that this was happening, and within about 10 minutes, they decided not to do it again, and I'm glad they did. And I think you've got to be really careful when you bleep things in these testimonies. I know they're words that you and I would never use on our programmes, because if we did, we would be taken off air. But I think in these circumstances, people need to know what was said.
OK, we're going to talk about a story surrounding Durham University. The Students' Union there has advertised safety training courses for students and staff around adult sex work. I'm just going to show you all the advert. You can see at the top, it says training opportunity, students involved in the adult sex industry. And then it goes on to say the Student Union position on students in sex work are clear: support, informed advice, destigmatisation and collaboration with expert organisations. Now, the university's minister, Michelle Donnellan, wasn't impressed. She told The Times that the university was legitimising a dangerous industry and badly failing in their duty to protect. Let's talk to Larissa Kennedy, the president of the National Union of Students. Larissa, what have you made of this story?
I think it's rather embarrassing that Michelle Donnellan has positioned herself in such a way that actually is trying to vilify students for responding to what are ever-growing costs in higher education. And in fact, many student sex workers do cite the gaps between the student funding, the support that students can receive to make ends meet, and the gap between that and the cost of living. We know that during the pandemic, 1 in 3 students has had to cut back on food in order to make ends meet. We know also that during the pandemic, 1 in 10 students has been turning to food banks in order to get by. And so when we have these material conditions created by Michelle Donnellan's very own government, it feels completely counterintuitive for the university's minister herself to be condemning students for turning to sex work and for condemning.
But because it's a slightly different point. I hear what you're saying about why you think students might feel they need to take on that sort of work because it's expensive and the cost of fees taken on as loans and so on and so forth. But the question I want to ask is about her criticism of the university legitimising, she says, a dangerous industry. Is she right?
Of course she's not right. I mean, I think that the problem is that this story has been completely sensationalised by both the media and politicians themselves, detracting from what is actually happening here, which is that we have a situation already where research indicates that around 6% of students are already in sex work. This isn't encouraging.
But should they be offering support? But should they be offering support? I do, but I just want you to answer that specific question. Should Durham University be offering training and support? It may be legitimate or it may be not. Michelle Donnellan doesn't think it is.
Any university and any students' union should absolutely be providing the training for those who are supporting students so that they know the legal well-being and safety implications and are able to respond to that, so that they are actively able to respond to any disclosures that they receive. And that is exactly what this training is doing. And so, of course, we should be rolling this out. And I think that the falsehoods that have been presented about what this training actually delivers is just producing a further culture of vilifying student sex workers.
All right,
which is
I'm just going to stop you there, but do stay with us, Larissa. I'm just going to open it up to the rest of the panel. Do you agree with Larissa, Laura?
No one is vilifying or condemning students or saying they don't care for their safety. What they're saying is that all sex work is part of a degrading trade in women's bodies, and Durham University is giving it a tacit endorsement. All sex work is unequal, it's exploitative, and it fuels a toxic misogyny. And the idea that there can be advisors to keep women safe when they're putting themselves into those highly dangerous positions, or that it should be endorsed by a university, is the absolute antithesis of what our higher education institutions should provide. And actually, that is the reason why you have, yes, Michelle Donnellan, a Conservative minister, but also Diane Abbott, who is on the left of the Labour Party, in complete agreement on this. And I think nearly all the feminists in Parliament would take the same view as me.
Larissa?
I mean, I think the feminists in Parliament should take a long, hard look at themselves and think about the agency of those sex workers. I think it's embarrassing that we're having this conversation without sex workers present. And actually, student sex workers can speak for themselves, and they have declared that they are, they have agency. They are, often, yes, of course, taking on these roles because of material conditions, but then opting into these roles. I don't think that we can put a blanket statement about misogyny. Of course, there are things to address within the adult sex industry, but those things come from giving agency to sex workers themselves rather than removing it, and by decriminalising and destigmatising, as it was just said.
All right, let me because we haven't got that long. Sonia, where are you? Because some people may look at this and say, look, it's happening. Whether you like it or not, in the way that Laura has expressed it, it's happening. There are some students who are engaged in sex work for whatever reasons. Is it right for the university to sort of lean into that and offer support and advice, or is it encouraging it almost and saying it's absolutely fine?
I think it depends on what is actually happening and what those conversations are. For me, it's extremely troubling if anything sanctioned by a university appears to imply to students that they can do sex work and prostitution safely, because I'm totally with Laura on this. It's inherently dangerous. There are dangers of doing it in person. There are dangers of doing it on a site like OnlyFans, where you've got 18-year-olds, young girls producing content that can be screenshotted by men that can come back to haunt them later on in their professional lives. It is dangerous. So nothing a university must never give the impression that it is possible to do this work in a safe way. That said, I agree with Laura. No one is vilifying students for this. We've got to look at why some students feel they're being pushed into this. And quite frankly, I think that Larissa is right. We need to be increasing grants for students from disadvantaged backgrounds. That's really important. But, they deserve support, but I'm really worried about this idea of destigmatisation. No one is saying women in sex work should be stigmatised. We absolutely should be stigmatising men who use prostitutes. There should be social stigma around that, and I'm worried about any university policy that appears to destigmatise men who use prostitutes.
Larissa?
I mean, I think, again, it's ridiculous that we're having this conversation without sex workers present, because ultimately, when we talk about destigmatisation, when we talk about the need to decriminalise, these things can't happen in the kind of context that is just being presented. That you can't have stigmatisation and destigmatisation. I'm not quite understanding.
All right. Well, look. Let me very quickly. We haven't got very long. Alan, a comment on this story. Where are you in terms of the university and what it's trying to do?
I think there's an urgent need for sex work in general, and I'm very drawn to the Swedish model of penalising the buying of sex but decriminalising the selling of sex. I think there's a wider discussion that needs to be had about why so many students, particularly, but also others, are relying on food banks and are having to go down this road. I'm not sure what's happening at Durham is the entry point to that conversation.
Right. Is it a safe step by Durham University, very briefly, Ian?
I'm wholly in favour of them doing it. We have to accept the world as it is, not how we would like it to be. But can I point out also there are male sex workers as well. It's not just women who are involved in this. And we don't complain about drug helplines telling people how to take drugs safely. So why would we complain about this?
Good point to end on from all of us. Bye-bye.